Hello, everyone. Welcome back to season 7 of the Erasing Shame podcast. My name is Victoria Chang, and I am your co-host for Encouraging Christian Asian Mental Health. This episode is twofold. Number 1, a brief introduction to Lament, specifically biblical lament, and putting out feelers for guests on that topic. Number 2, updates on the season's topic and the plans that we have to expand what Christian Asian mental health looks like in collaboration with non-Christians as well, because they are also essential to erasing the stigma of mental health. And let's get started. So, I've talked about this briefly before, but in 2018, before I dropped out, I was in Wheaton, Illinois at Wheaton College, which is a evangelical private 4-year university, and I took a class called Hunger 101. I believe it was called Poverty, Justice, and Reconciliation. We had an awesome professor. His name is James Huff, Professor James Huff. Shout out to all my classmates in that class that made it a vivacious, albeit eye-opening struggle to unlearn things and learn. In that class, we learned about topics like, well, not just topics, but world events, macro suffering, the Rwandan genocide, the Salvadoran Civil War. We also talked about micro suffering and what emotional, spiritual, and physical poverty looks like. And a lot of the topics were very challenging to think about, especially because, we're in suburban America. Granted, a lot of us have different backgrounds, but we have not gone through as much suffering as the people that we were learning about have. And this happens for a myriad of reasons. And part of our response should not be savior complex or immediacy. And maybe we ourselves don't have the solutions from the outside. And maybe what it takes is slowing down and listening to the people who are suffering themselves, but also seeking wisdom from the creator of the universe. As a Christian, biblical lament is one of those tools. I'm rambling a little bit, but highly recommend a book from that class called Reconciling All Things by Chris Rice and Emmanuel Katongole. They talk about biblical lament with examples from the Bible and also stories from their work on the ground. And that is just a loose, general summary. But from that book, I was opened in perspective to the practice of lament that I did not grow up practicing in a Chinese Christian church. In fact, even in other churches that I went to, the practice of lament may be limited to liturgy. And so I have led workshops on private lament based off of that book by Chris Rice and Emmanuel Kotongle. But for any people in ministry, whether you are a pastor, whether you are an elder, a deacon, person in worship, arts, ministry, a layman even, if you have any experience with lament, and not just private lament, but public lament within a church context, I would like to pose this question. And if you could contact me at erasingshame.com, let's have a conversation and even record it potentially. But this is a question. Where and how might lament fulfill its purpose in the modern church? How can churches be better at holding space for people grieving, processing trauma, micro and macro, struggling with their faith, or facing mental health challenges, both short term and long term? There is so much suffering in the world today, and it's not necessarily comparable. And people have a lot of things to say. Um, so, as Christians, what is our first response? Do we stay silent? Absolutely not. Absenteeism is not our calling. However, we are told to model Jesus Christ. And it is very confusing, especially for me as a younger person, to clear out the noise, the distractions, step off the platforms that I have, and really seek a way to bear witness to suffering, whether it's fatal mental illness crises at the hands of law enforcement, or silent genocides in multiple countries, whether Sudan, the Congo, in Gaza. I said it. If you want to argue about it, you can look up what constitutes a genocide in the United States, but in general, look at humanitarian law. I'm not here to argue. But I am here to say, like, there is a lot of suffering going on. And so how do we bear witness and also deal with our own suffering without crumbling, without questioning God's authority? But we are able to come to him very honestly. We see that in Jeremiah, we see that in Job, we see that in the Psalms. I am rambling again, but this topic of lament is not something that I can really tackle myself. I have led workshops, like I said, in Atlanta, in Maryland, even in my own family. Thanks, Mom. But there's just so much to bear witness to, and God does see it all. And you may ask, where is God amidst the suffering, my own suffering or the world's suffering? And how do we respond, and what is our response? I've been avoiding this episode for a while because I am a recovering perfectionist, and I want to present things neatly as if I have things together and I know what to do, but I really don't. And so I'm asking for help, for different perspectives. I know that the Black church has a lot more practice with biblical lament. because of the history in the United States of racism and slavery and unjust systems. And so I don't have much experience with the depth of lament, of great loss, of systemic oppression, losing your children, losing your home, being displaced, and so on. I just got more general as I spoke more. Um, all this to say, here I am imperfectly before you. Um, and I will present that question in the summary. All right, part 2 of this episode. This topic for this season is encouraging Christian Asian mental health. And in order to encourage Christian Asian mental health, you cannot box yourself in to only Christians. Non-Christians are professionals in their fields of mental health, and they also practice radical self-compassion and have very valuable, essential contributions to this conversation. And we cannot exclude other perspectives from erasing the stigma of mental health. And so please look forward to more conversations with more people under the AANHPI umbrella. And I will close this episode here. It is very imperfect. It is very rambly. I don't want to label it as ADHD because although I'm very familiar with that, I don't think that is strictly why I rambled. I think I rambled because this is a topic that I cannot tackle alone, and it has been percolating in my mind for a long time. However, fleshing it out in conversation is not the same as leading a workshop on it, and you can always learn more and improve. And even as I read Jeremiah, even as I go back to Job and talk with my dad about the way that God answers Job and the way that God sometimes doesn't answer Jeremiah, or the ways that he does, I'm learning more about God's character, that he is not just near to the brokenhearted, but he's also such a holy God. And what does it mean to fear God? All of this, lots of questions, but I just want to be transparent in some ways. And thank you for joining us for this season. Stay tuned for episodes with some close friends of mine, some siblings, and people that I've met. Yeah, that's really all I have to say for now. This is going to be hard for me to release because it's very off script. And I didn't actually touch on the definitions of lament, biblical lament, and what does that look like. But I highly encourage you to check out the book Reconciling All Things by Chris Rice and Emmanuel Kotongle, because they are some of the experts on that. They might not even call themselves that, but I learned a lot from that book. And the last thing I'll say about lament is that it is a private practice. It is also a public practice, but it is essential. God himself laments. And so that tool of lament has carried me through a lot of personal struggles, especially when I felt alone or distraught. So that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you for tuning in. And let's cue DJ's outro.
Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.